So I'm speaking with composer Christopher Willis, who has made quite an impact with his score for The Death of Stalin. Chris got to start working with composers like Rupert Gregson-Williams, Gregson-Williams and Henry Jackman. Some of his notable TV work includes scoring such a great series as Veep, The Lion Guard, and Mickey Mouse for Disney. And he has now found himself on the shortlist for the Oscars. Chris, thanks so much for speaking today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Connor.
So I'd love to start kind of just gonna get a sense of your background and kind of what point in your life did music find you, or you found music, however you see it. And do you remember that kind of pivotal moment where you're like, okay, this is my career now?
Oh, yeah. Well, I loved music from a very young age. I didn't take any lessons like as a tiny kid. But I have very early memories of tinkering around on keyboards and on the piano and being very interested. I started learning the piano when I was 8, and joined the church choir shortly after that.
That seems to be a path that a lot of English boys go through.
Yeah, that's funny, isn't it? A lot of composers in the Hollywood scene have that same thing going on. Yeah, and I very much had that. So I had a very kind of classical music teenage years, where everyone splits off into musical cliques, and then there's kind of the classical kids who've just decided to do that. So and I was thinking that I was going to be a pianist for many years. I loved music, and I loved writing music, but the sort of thing in Britain in the 90s, if you were interested in composing, I felt very sort of railroaded into modern music that was happening in the classical scene at that time, and I was very confused about that. So my attempts at composition sort of petered out as my teens went by, and I felt like my composition teachers were less and less interested in actually teaching me the rudiments, and more interested in modernism. So then I was sort of basically a pianist, a classical pianist, for a few years, and I went to the Royal Academy of Music and studied the piano there, and it was after that, and I was just at the beginning of a career as a concert pianist, and I was incredibly restless, and not sure if this was if this was really what I wanted to be doing.
Right.
And even after that, I didn't immediately get straightforwardly into composition. I then went. Well, I had been at Cambridge as an undergrad. I've said this backwards in the wrong order. So I went to Cambridge for the music undergrad, which is a very very old school undergrad, rather like studying English literature for undergrad. So you aren't really committing at that point to saying that you're a composer or an instrumentalist or whatever. And then I went to the Royal Academy for the piano, and then I sort of used Cambridge like I think people have for hundreds of years, where you have a sort of quarter life crisis. And kind of like an old medieval monastery, they say, come back, it's fine. You can defer making decisions about life for a few more years. So I went back to Cambridge and became a musicologist for a few years.
Oh, wow.
And I credit that period with doing a lot for me, because I was analyzing music all the time, working with an amazing musicologist called Dean Sutcliffe. And I was also teaching the whole time. I was teaching undergrads. I was only in my early 20s at that point, and they were sort of 18, 19, 20. So I was just 2 steps ahead of them all the time, trying to teach them fugue and counterpoint and tonal composition. And going round and round over that sort of really cemented my love of writing music, but also just my knowledge of that. It's such a cliche, but it's you really expose all of the holes in your own knowledge. If you have bright young people endlessly asking you about it,
right?
At every turn, you realize that you don't really know anything. You can't answer any of their questions. or you're marking their work and having an aversion to some maneuver that they've done. And I've been learning music all my life, and I have no explanation as to why I don't like what they've done. There's no parallels in it. There's nothing that I can point easily to. So that was an amazing process over those years.
Yeah. And so when did it become kind of geared towards the film and TV world? When did you meet Rupert? How did that kind of start? And did that kind of take you on that path?
I think looking back, that had sort of been lurking in my mind since forever. But it was during those years that I was back in Cambridge that I just sort of dawned on me eventually. I've been just as obsessed with movies my entire life as I had been with music. I just never really put the two together. I wasn't really one of those people who grew up listening to and thinking about, or I should say listening consciously to, film music. But I loved movies, and so I knew lots of film music in that weird passive way that most people who love movies,
right,
movie music. I had this sense, I suppose, to go back to my angst about concert music. I had this sense that it would just be so amazing to be somewhere where there were huge numbers of people writing music, where you really had to do it every day. Had to actually work for people. People had to listen to it and say, yes, that moves me. And I just sort of became completely besotted in the end with this idea that maybe I would come out to California and join this community. This is sort of stupid and dorky to admit, but I think in my brain it was very analogous to the big cities of music composition in the past, because I was doing musicology, so I was thinking about this, Vienna in the late 18th century. That what you needed is thousands of people all trying to do the same thing at the same time, and then you finally get some decent music. So I had all sorts of reasons for getting really excited about it, and I sent a demo to Rupert. Rupert Gregson-Williams was the first person who gave me a job. I was incredibly lucky. He was arguably quite rash, because on paper I lacked a lot of the qualifications that one should really have. Looking back, I mean, if myself then had asked me now for advice, I would have advised him to get a bit more experience before moving out here. But I joined Rupert's studio, and he was an incredible teacher, incredible mentor. He was working out of Remote Control Productions, Hans Zimmer's place.
Right.
So I was suddenly thrust into, musically I had this, I was quite well equipped, but I just had to be very humble and accept that I was a complete beginner at everything else. I mean, I was learning about synths and learning about computers, learning about how modern film music is synced up, and learning about films and the way that one talks about films. Absolutely. Sort of.
I mean, it was probably like more of like a shock just to learn the business and the kind of that kind of side of everything.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I remember being surprised. This is funny. I remember being surprised that one even got notes. Being at the back of a room with Rupert having a meeting. I was taking notes or something, and just astonished at the basic dynamic. That the filmmaker is in charge. The filmmaker has hired the composer. If the filmmaker doesn't like something because it doesn't seem to be serving the scene, then they just say so, and the composer 99 times out of 100 agrees, unless they strongly think that it's that they're wrong. The composer agrees to attempt at least to try to do what the filmmaker says. I had no idea that. I thought the composer just sort of waved their locks of hair at the top of a stone tower and scribbled away. So yeah, as you say, to learn that it is that it is a business. It is that things move fast. It's the real world. It's not some sort of romantic fantasy. Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. So I want to jump into some of your projects. You got to score Veep, which is this amazing Emmy-winning series comedy on HBO, starring the amazing Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and you co-scored it with Rupert. And I'm just interested in, because it's a 30-minute comedy. It's not heavily reliant on music. So what role does music play, and what were you able to do with kind of the limited canvas that you have there?
Well, for me, one of the key things was knowing The Thick of It, which is a sitcom in Britain, which is not part of the same world exactly as Veep, but is the creation of Armando Iannucci, who later created Veep, and is also concerned with politics and has some of the same sort of ideological concerns, if you like. The same thematic things that it's interested in. The Thick of It has no music at all. The show starts with action. It's in that very handheld style that we've come to know from things like The Office. It starts with footage. A title card comes up with no music. I think often we still hear people talking in the scene they were in with the title card, and then we're back to action. And I was aware that was kind of the way that Armando was thinking. Now, Westminster and Washington, Westminster being where the hub of politics in London, are very different. In Westminster, everyone's on foot and it's always raining, and it's the paparazzi follow you everywhere and catch you kind of dropping your suitcase, dropping your briefcase or whatever. And the politicians in Britain always just seem to look utterly wretched and pathetic.
We have pathetic, wretched ones here too. Don't worry.
In Washington and in Veep, I immediately had the impression that there was a certain pomposity that Armando was trying to capture, with the way that everywhere she goes, even if she needs a bagel, the Veep has to go off in a motorcade with a huge guard. And just that lent itself to a little bit of music. But I could sort of tell that there was some caution there, that he didn't want the music to help the comedy. The comedy is fast paced, the dialogue is very fast paced. So I had this sense that we just do the bare minimum. But yeah, we immediately had some interesting conversations about the music. Armando is a real expert on classical music. You can have a very wide-ranging conversation about classical music with him. In fact, usually when I talk to him, I end up learning something and coming away with some composer or other to listen to that I hadn't heard.
That's amazing.
It's weird, isn't it? Isn't it just such a gift to be working with someone like that? So in my head, I've sort of always had this idea that what we were doing, you'd have to ask Rupert if he agrees. There's sort of an imaginary composer that I'm not sure ever quite existed, somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, post Copland, because Copland often had those. Veep has all those sort of motoric rhythms.
Yeah,
you get that in Copland, but then you get it again later with minimalism, with Steve Reich and with John Adams especially. I say especially. John Adams sounds especially kind of Americana. So there's a sort of link between Copland and Adams, I think. So I'm sort of imagining a frightfully patriotic imaginary composer, sort of halfway between the two, who's scoring this show as though it were a documentary and is very unquestioning.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's sort of what goes on in my head. I mean, the funny thing then in Veep is that, of course, the stakes got higher and higher.
Right.
She starts, and at the start of the show, the joke is that she doesn't seem to really do anything. But of course, these plots of shows being what they are, without giving too much away to people who are just starting the show, things get more and more high stakes as the show goes on. So strangely, we found ourselves talking more about bigger pieces of music. And if you've got headlines flashing on the screen about some huge world event happening that's been triggered by some stupid thing that one of our characters has done, then the music has to actually be quite big, right, in order to deal with that.
Well, I mean, working on that show, you built up a relationship with Armando, and now, of course, he directed the Death of Stalin. So, talk about when he kind of called upon you for that, and what were those initial conversations about for the film, and what did you want to do musically? What did the film need from you, from the music?
Well, again, we were able to have these conversations, using classical music as reference points. We met up, and he actually pitched for me the start of the film, where the concert is happening, and the Mozart concerto has to be played a second time, because Stalin wants a recording and there isn't one, and we learn that we learn quite sort of subtly that if they don't trap the audience in this concert hall and play the whole piece again, that everyone in the whole place could end up getting killed for no good reason. And that's kind of how we're introduced to the Stalinist purges. Well, Armando had this phrase, let's just imagine that we resurrected the Soviet Union's finest composer.
It seems you're always embodying this other imaginary composer.
Yeah, exactly. There were the famous composer for us now is Shostakovich. We also listened to Prokofiev a lot, because Prokofiev didn't spend all of his time in the Soviet Union. What I discovered as I looked at the music at that time is that there were lots of composers who were all doing vaguely similar things. Shostakovich was one of them, but there are many others. And we discovered that you could line up their music with the film, and you get this interesting effect, because it's rather over the top, and it doesn't sound exactly like modern film music. It sounds very, very dissonant and strident, but it creates a very interesting effect. Sort of reminded me of the effect that you get in other comedies. In Ghostbusters, the music is very kind of full on,
right.
But even also in Young Frankenstein, or in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where the music is just very very rambunctious.
Yeah.
Not really playing comedy, not really playing lightness ever, but playing things, taking it to 11 all the time in terms of orchestral kind of heroics. So I started to do a lot of homework and to think about this trick that we could pull off, where the whole thing would be a sort of method acting. It would all sort of sound like it was from the 1950s. There then end up being a lot of other worries, like how much should it sound like it was all taken from one piece? Should it sound like it's the same? So really trying to make it sound like it was all this like sort of imaginary symphony. And I should say, I think at a very early stage, Armando had even wondered about using Soviet music and not having a composer, or just having me doing a few bits. We discovered early on that how difficult that is. It's incredibly challenging to get this music, which has its own trajectories and its own ups and downs, to do the things that you want. Actually, I was watching the film just recently and noticing it's been wonderful hearing from people that they have in some cases really thought that they were listening to Soviet music. I was talking to Bruce Broughton, who's a friend of my wife and I, and he was very impressed and had thought that he was listening to Soviet music. I think if you watch the film lots of times, or if you watched one scene lots of times, you would start to see, it is doing what film music does. The climax goes right here, and then the dialogue happens, and then as soon as the dialogue starts, the trumpets come back in again. But the first time you see it, you, especially if you don't know, it does. The impression is of thinking, what is this? I don't know this. This sounds like some Soviet thing that I don't know. But anyway, I'm sorry to go back to what I was saying. Yeah, the worry about how much should it use the same music over and over, or the same theme. And this this actually was a major worry as I was working on it. Should it? And there's not an enormous amount of music in the film, so we're going to have music, and then we're going to be very concerned with dialogue, and then we'll come back to music. So my feeling was we can actually have one or two themes that we hear a lot, as long as they have a slightly symphonic feel, and they get reworked. But then when you record all of that music in one go, it's slightly alarming, because you're hearing that theme so much. You have to sort of try and imagine, spacing it all out again over an hour, 40 minutes. So there's a lot of angsting about the specifics.
Well, I think it all turned out, amazingly, and it's just a perfect fit to what Armando's vision is, and I'm curious. You talked about finding that, going kind of over the top and not playing to the comedy, but I guess was finding the tone tricky? I always look at comedies like that, and where you see the music is playing it serious, it's playing it kind of the seriousness in the character's head. Whether you look back to spoofs like Airplane and Naked Gun, where it's like it's never playing the comedy. Was that as simple as that, or was it tricky to find the tone?
Different bits presented different challenges. There was one, actually the first of these slow-mo intros. For anyone who hasn't seen the film, we're introduced to the main characters with these slow motion sequences that I don't know quite what they're doing. It's the sort of thing you might see in a Guy Ritchie gangster film. Only these are Russian politicians. And the music, each time the music swells up, the characters go in slow motion, and titles come up on the screen to tell us who's who. And the first one, well, we see Khrushchev and Beria, who's going to end up being his main antagonist, and they're doing this weird belly dance for Stalin at this drunken party. They're like bumping tummies with each other. And yet, of course, we vaguely heard of Khrushchev, no matter how little Russian history we know, and we know, dark stuff is likely to come. And so there was some worry about that cue. Should it be huge? Right. Should it be very, very quiet and morose? And that was one of the first cues where they hadn't found any temp that was working, and so I wrote a cue, and my cue ended up in the film quite early on. The solution in the end was to be very somber, but almost like it was the introduction to a symphony. So it's, in a way, it's not saying anything in particular. It's just very somber and like an introduction,
right.
Introductory stanza. I'm trying to think of places where. Did it go too far? Did it tip over? There were places where I tried music and it just, it was better to take it out.
Right.
The places where I thought that it would be interesting to play the excitement, and actually, even though the scene is edgy and exciting, because it's also supposed to be funny, it actually sometimes works better to leave it empty. There's a strange scene where the NKVD are about to pounce on this old man. We see the old man walking towards us, and the van ominously driving up, and then the guards all get out, and he starts running, and they run towards him. And I have a very ominous piece that plays as the van plays. And initially, I was going to play the whole scene of them attacking him, and thinking that we just gradually realized the truth, which is actually he's a retired doctor, and they've killed all the good doctors, or all the non-retired doctors. But in the end, we took the music out just as they start running towards him. So you sort of set the scene up. dramatically, but then as soon as there's an opportunity to laugh at the way that he's running and the way that they're running after him, you just delicately bow out musically and let the scene play on its own.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of the way to kind of walk that line with comedy and just make sure music isn't stepping on the comedy.
It's another way that trying to pretend it was all this one big symphony and trying to use certain themes quite a lot helps, actually, because you in a way you don't notice that there isn't that much music, because when the music's there, it's quite big, and it's becoming an earworm. Yeah. And then it doesn't matter so much if there are great swathes of the film that don't have any music. You still have the vague memory that there was this big symphonic score.
Right. So I mean, yeah, Death of Stalin, fantastic film, fantastic score. Congratulations to you and Armando. I think and seeing you and him grow together, because I think you're working on his next film too, The Personal History of David Copperfield. Is that happening?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So what can we look forward to in that one?
Well, I'm right in the thick of it right now, so as it were. It's actually kind of hard to talk about because my brain is
still in the mix of it. Yeah.
We have been doing some of the same process of listening to lots of things and sending things back and forth. The film, of course, is rooted in the 19th century, but the feel of it is very contemporary. One of the things we've been talking about is that Dickens feels so vivid and immediate and doesn't feel like a fusty piece of history when you go back and read it. Right. So the score is not right now sounding sort of mid 19th century or anything like that. We've been listening to a lot more recent stuff. But you know what's always interesting working with Armando is he just doesn't have the typical Hollywood instincts. So he's very interested in 20th century, 21st century concert music. So we've been listening to all kinds of things that you don't associate with movies. And it's crazy that I'm almost coming full circle back to what I was talking about earlier, and the environment in which I was learning composition in England, of course, in the 90s. I'm almost back at sort of modern British music, although I'm kind of looking at it in a different way that I'm much more comfortable with now.
Well, that's amazing. Chris, I want to thank you so much for your time today and for sharing a bit of your insight, and congrats on everything. I think you're such a unique voice in the industry, and it's been such a pleasure for me to listen to you and hear your work. And congrats on The Death of Stalin, and best of luck this award season.
Cheers, you're very kind. It's been great talking to you.